And now we'll go to the first panel, Professor Alexander Aptekar from the Architectural Technology Department. And the panel is Environmental Justice.
Thank you all and welcome to City Tech's EcoFest. It's with great pleasure that I get to introduce this panel. We have Eric Wood, who is a champion environmental campaign organizer for NYPIRG and has been working for 17 years all across New York State, hard to try to reduce our exposure to toxic chemicals, and particularly ones produced by fracking and fossil fuel industry. Santosh, who is a community organizer with the Food and Weather Watch and the Food and Weather Action. He has started activism fighting to promote clean water on Long Island Sound and is a union organizer, and now has been particularly involved in dealing and thinking about the gas impacts right here in New York City and energy production right here in New York City, and has been an advocate for the Green New Deal here in New York State. Montash Moitra is a great pleasure, has been so active in so many things, a designer, an architect, an artist, the director of El Piato's Green Light District. And so, I mean, it's a complete honor to have all of you and to have you here. She's also had her work exhibited in the MoMA, among other things. So it's, and it's been incredibly active on looking at the impact of pollution in local districts around the city. So it's with great pleasure that I invite these panels to join us. And I'm hoping that we can, Eric, you can start us by introducing your self and the great work that you've done.
Yeah, absolutely, Alexander. Thank you so much for hosting this panel today, and huge thanks to the other panelists, and yeah, to City College for hosting this. I'm very happy to be a part of it. So my name's Eric Wood. I'm an environmental campaign organizer with NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group. And I'm happy to talk about NYPIRG's involvement in environmental justice today. Happy Earth Day, right? Happy Earth Week. We've been celebrating all week here. And, you know, I woke up on Monday really excited to kick off Earth Week. Had a tick in my back, and then got my second dose of the vaccine that day. So the only thing I kept thinking this day was about climate change and how this is all related. You know, the whole spread of disease thing, which Stephen touched on earlier. So I'm feeling awful all week, better now. The fear of Lyme disease is rather new here in the region, the Hudson Valley. I know a couple decades old, but ticks were really only something you had to worry about if you went to Maryland, you know, when I was growing up. But the warming climate has spread them north, and now Lyme disease is an epidemic here in the Northeast, right? And it's a huge concern. It's something that's real and something that's caused by climate change, which, you know, humans did this to ourselves. We did this to each other. And, you know, this is more of a broad example, as well as like CO2 emissions and those types of things. But more specifically, when you get into environmental justice, these are targeted communities, you know. The other thing on Monday, you know, big in the news this week, Derek Chauvin is, you know, found guilty of the murder of George Floyd, right? Which, you know, that's great. But then we see another young person murdered by police. You know, these are the same communities that have all of the world's problems, the communities that need to change, you know. And NYPIRG has been on this for a long time. It's not an easy fix on any level. You know, we started in 1973 as a good government group. And one of the first things we worked on was legislative profiling, because politicians, you didn't even have to announce like who you were when you're running for office. So who's making these decisions? We didn't even really know at this point. So it's something NYPIRG worked on early, and continued to work on other areas of social justice, protecting consumers from predatory lenders, making higher education free for everybody. We need that back. Making mass transit so that it works for all people, and making sure that all people have access to register to vote and to get to the polls on election day. And I know I'm supposed to focus on environmental justice, so our work on that here, NYPIRG has been huge with, starting working with Lois Gibbs in the late 70s, early 80s, up in Love Canal, and helped establish the first Superfund site. So that's a Hooker toxic chemical company that we took on back then. We also went on to hold the largest anti-nuke rally in history in 1990, pretty much putting an end to the construction of all new nuclear power plants because of how ridden our state is with them and how dangerous they are. So we led the charge on that, and these, all power plants, nuclear, whatever, they're not like put in the communities of rich white people necessarily. So we've been on that for a long time, and knowing NYPIRG's history, getting involved with this, I grew up less fortunate and wanted to help people and wanted to figure out how to get involved. And I found this job working, this job advertisement, working for the environment with NYPIRG, and it was knocking on doors. It was so out of my comfort zone. I'm like, I want to help, but I don't want to do that, but the only way to really create change and get out and do something is to get out of your comfort zone. And it took me a while to figure that out. And, but it's just like kept doing it. And then opportunities and involvement and my impact on these issues only got way heavier, and I think same goes for NYPIRG, really. The world's getting tougher to deal with, regardless of who's in office on the state level, on the federal level. When I started way back when, we were working against the coal industry, and, the tactic was then not just like shut down coal. The cleverness of the campaign was, well, if we put these mercury regulations on them that are too expensive for them to operate, they'll have to shut themselves down, right? So we did that. We won, and these coal-fired power plants, again, they're in communities the industry wouldn't, live in themselves that are putting them there. So on from there, we got a little more broad on our work with CO2 emissions on the federal level. But then the Obama era really opened up the fracking industry, the fracking revolution in New York State. Really, we want to talk climate change. We've seen methane lead to more more warming, most likely, than all the CO2 leading up to that in the past decade, because of how much we're fracking here in the United States. We're not doing that here in New York, and I was glad to be with NYPIRG, part of that campaign, knocking on doors, going to press conferences, to rallies, getting phone calls to the governor, keeping the pressure on local level, on the state level, to make sure we're not doing that here in New York, but it's still a huge global problem. And then beyond fracking, we also worked a lot on protecting water. And again, in communities that I can think of right now that we're working with, Newburgh, New York, is having trouble with their water. Hoosick Falls, Hoosick Falls, for those who aren't familiar, it's upstate New York, abandoned by the Teflon industry decades ago, and not a very fortunate community anymore. So and then the list goes on and on with what we need to tackle, but it all comes back to the same areas and the same people that are a revolving door in our politics, that are running fossil fuels, running plastics, the people that can be fixing our water, the people that can be moving to renewable energy. And that's, at the end of the day, we got to remember is, work together to stop this assault on our communities. And that's why I'm here today to talk about, and would be happy to answer any questions on how to get involved with that later. And yeah, thank you again, Alexander.
Thank you. That's a great overview of work you're doing. I'm hoping, Santosh, you could share some of the work that you've been working on.
For sure. And a lot of what Eric said is applicable to all of us. But thank you again for organizing this, Alexander, and to City College. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Santosh Nandabalan. I'm a community organizer with Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Action. Food and Water Watch has been around for nearly 2 decades. It's an environmental advocacy group that works for clean air, clean water, and a livable planet for all. And kind of similar to NYPIRG, right, is like here in New York, I have a focus on New York State, but we work on a bevy of national issues. But I think our real core priorities is, fighting back against the fossil fuel industry, including really a lot of good work we did alongside NYPIRG in the movement to ban fracking, and what we're going to continue to do to pressure this administration to make sure that we are not fracking moving forward in the country, as well as fighting factory farms, which are huge producers of methane and huge accelerators of climate change. And fighting water privatization throughout the country. And I think the basic thing here, right, it is a lot of this is intuitive. We're here on Earth Day. Everyone deserves a healthy home, clean water, clean food. None of this is really, no one's really going to argue with that point. We're all human beings and we all have basic rights. But when push comes to shove, there are these big money interests. There are corporate executives that want to keep their profit margins, that want to keep the status quo so that they can maintain their profits. That comes at the expense of environmental justice communities. So you're seeing, like, I live in Brooklyn. There are marginalized communities on the shoreline. There are communities that were devastated during Hurricane Sandy that still have not recovered. They get targeted because of these giant corporate interests. And really a large part of the work in New York State is fighting back against the frack gas development at power plant sites, at pipeline sites. And in terms of environmental justice, the communities that are getting hit aren't your wealthy suburbias. They're the ones where executives and fossil fuel industry folks think they can sneak through a pipeline without much public oversight. Or they think that, hey, we can make enough backroom deals to put in a power plant. So in New York State, we after a huge amount of protesting, of putting pressure on Governor Cuomo, there was this victory with the ban on fracking, and that felt really good. And it was a huge moment that has now made fracking part of the conversation nationwide. But still, we import from Pennsylvania and Ohio, fracked natural gas, which makes its way to compressor stations, to power plants throughout the state, and it keeps us reliant on that frack gas. And we talk about carbon emissions. Everyone on this call gets global warming. The amount of methane that is produced and released from fracking is egregious and is really one of the biggest accelerators to climate change. So the work for us is really making that connection for folks that, like, hey, when you are turning up the heat in your homes, or when you are turning on your TV or turning on the electricity, right, that's powered by frack gas. And we need to now change that thought process to make that move to 100% renewable electricity, 100% renewable energy. And the way to do that is to stop the build out of this fossil fuel infrastructure, similar to the way we stopped fracking, and make sure our government isn't really listening to these corporate interests that have maintained this structure, but is now listening to the frontline communities that have been affected, to the advocacy groups that are fighting for this, and to the residents that are bearing the brunt of the air pollution and the water pollution. We're here on Earth Day today because we care about what's around us. And I think there's a level of like a spiritual understanding that, like, the Earth isn't for us to exploit. We're a part of this ecosystem. And we need to respect that. So that being said, a lot of the work is stopping power plants and pipelines. I'm sure we're going to dive deeper into it. There are a bunch in New York City, a bunch throughout the Hudson Valley in New York State, and a bunch nationwide. A lot of folks are following what's happened with the Keystone Pipeline. The movement is now going to grow where we need to put kind of these indigenous lands, put the rights of people before corporate interests. And that means stopping fossil fuel infrastructure at Food and Water Watch. So that's a big portion of what I do. I'm sure we're going to go in more into that as we go. But again, I wanted to thank you for hosting this and making it happen.
Thank you for that overview. I'm hoping that Masoom could explain some of the wonderful work she's been doing and her advocacy.
I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. Well,
Yes,
thanks so much, Santosh. And thank you so much, Mark, as well. I think everything that I'm going to talk about with respect to El Puente is very much to do with, oh, whoops, I don't know what's going on. It's very much connected to everything you said. In fact, like El Puente has a long history of working with NYPIRG, and our founder, Francis, reminded me of that when we were going to the presentation, that, you know, there's a long friendship there. And we are also working on, one of the things we're also doing is opposing the North Brooklyn pipeline. So, you know, there's a lot of things to do together in the future. But I'll just introduce myself. My name is Masoom Moitra. I'm a community urban planner, a design architect. I also direct El Puente's Greenlight District. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the air quality and toxic air issues we have here. Someone asked a question about how do you make all of this actionable in a very localized community. And I think that's the perspective that I'm going to give. And how we use the framework of equity and self-determination in doing that work. And happy Earth Day to everyone, of course. So El Puente is the community human rights organization, and we were founded in 1982, around almost 40 years back now, with the help of our founder, Luis Garden Acosta, and our co-founders, Francis Lucena, who's now the president, and Gino Maldonado. So El Puente came from a legacy of the Young Lords, the Young Christian Workers movement. So there was a lot of like a movement history in the work. Luis was one of the co-founders, and therefore, you know, a lot of the framework of how we thought about environmental justice, how we thought about education, health, etc., was connected to that. And at that time, Williamsburg, now as we know it, is of course totally different. But at that time, Williamsburg, especially that particular area, was considered like the teenage gang violence capital of New York City. A lot of poverty, unemployment, and in that context, El Puente came around. And of course, along with, because it was, you know, mainly a low and moderate income Latino community, and it still remains a low and moderate, like there's a poverty corridor in there. Gentrification has wiped essentially out a lot of the people who were there 40 years back, but there still remains a corridor, and this is the corridor that El Puente serves. And because you know, of what we call environmental racism, a lot of the hazardous waste facilities were sited here or close to this community. So a lot of the initial movement work that El Puente was doing was around, and some examples of that are shutting down, and this was in partnership with NYPIRG and UJO, shutting down a 55-story incinerator in the community, and running a campaign to limit the activities of a radioactive and hazardous waste storage facility called Radiac. The thing about, and what was special about El Puente was that all of this was happening through the leadership of young people. So a lot of like young people were involved in really understanding what the issues were, studying them, and also campaigning to stop them. And often like the arts were used as a way to do that, to bring political consciousness. and political change, of course. El Puente is also co-founder of NEJA, which is New York City's Environmental Justice Alliance, and we still work with them to fight for waste equity, cleaner urban transportation, and green infrastructure. So one of the things, because I'm going to be talking about air quality today, one of the things that started El Puente's work with air quality and asthma is that in the 90s, we led the study of like 5,000 neighbors in the South Side. And that came out like after 3 years study about what the asthma levels were like. It became one of the first scientific peer-reviewed articles that were actually community-led. Because, you know, in the scientific world, there isn't a lot of community-led academic work happening. And this was really one of the first reports that was published in the American Journal of Public Health. And that continued into a study of indoor pollution as well. So the air quality campaign that we are doing now really sits under the Green Light District, you know, which I'm a part of as well. And why I want to talk about the Green Light District is I think because basically it's a holistic approach to self-development, community self-development that talks through the lens of self-determination. And that these are a lot of big words, but what just to dig a little deeper into it, what we are really talking about is that you cannot talk about environmental justice in a silo. You have to talk about it in a community like the South Side, and in most environmental justice communities, you have to talk about it in relationship with affordable living, in relationship with gentrification, with health and wellness, with education, and with how arts and culture and the cultural genocide happening is really in connection with all of these. So that's really the approach we take when we are talking about the environment. And of course, we root it in the fact that it has to be community-led. So through the Green Light District, there's the part where, you know, as residents and as leaders in the community, we work with understanding the issue. Then we work with like studying the issue, often using citizen science tools. Again, citizen science is something that's not just institutional. It can also live in community. It doesn't have to be in a university. It can also be on the streets. And that's the kind of science we're talking about. And then there's a third part, which is proposing solutions, and which we also, through the Green Light District, we want those to be community-led solutions too. And the project I'll discuss is an example of that. So in a way, because El Puente is all about principles, we have these 12 principles that we work with. The idea is how do you really put these principles to action, and what would they look like in the realm of sustainability? What does it mean to connect health and wellness to energy efficiency, to education and culture, to transportation, and the relationship between personal well-being, community well-being, and the planet's well-being, and the fact that they're all connected. So, so just to get into the South Side of Williamsburg a little bit, some of you might have been there, and some of you might not have. So you can see some pictures that I've put here. And basically, it's a place where a lot of the transit infrastructure in the city intersects. So, you know, there's the traffic from the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, from the Williamsburg Bridge. There's a bus depot right there. It's also close to like waste transfer stations and other industrial infrastructure. So a lot of trucks go through there, a lot of emissions. And on top of it, there's a lot of lack of trees and greenery. So you can see in the map that I've put here, and also in the image next to it, that the Williamsburg Bridge and BQ literally cut through parks in the community very strategically. So this is why this is not just an environmental issue, but an environmental justice issue, because, you know, the planning infrastructure that was created in the Moses era, in the Robert Moses era, really was planned to cut through this kind of sensitive infrastructure in communities of color, in low-income communities of color. So this was strategic. It was by plan, by design. And now these communities, you know, all the way 40, 50 years into it, are still facing the repercussions of having all of this infrastructure sited, because they are like triangles of pollution. And, you know, and these problems are still unaddressed and unmitigated, which is a huge issue. On top of this, there's also a very depending on the wealth of the community, because even within North Brooklyn, there's the wealthy and gentrified part of it. And then there's the part that hasn't really been wiped out just yet. And you can see a big difference between how much green spaces there are and how healthy those green spaces are. So there are almost 22 times per capita more green spaces in the rest of New York City than in this particular area. So you see that the inequity and the environmental justice issue can be really seen in the distribution of open spaces, in the maintenance of open spaces, in the investment in greening infrastructure as well. So as a result of this, rates of asthma-related hospitalizations for children and adults, and especially children, because parks are used by children, you know. So there are like 3 generations of people sometimes suffering from asthma, which are double those of the rest of New York City. And we know that's an equity issue because there have been endless studies that tell us that not just is this infrastructure cited in our communities, but also the fact that people of color live with 66% more of air pollution in the US. COVID-19 has made this much worse because there have been a recent Harvard study found out that places that already have air pollution in their communities historically have suffered of higher death rates because of COVID, because COVID attacks the respiratory system, and there's a lack of open spaces to mitigate this issue. So, and we already know that COVID disproportionately affected communities of color, especially Latino and Black communities. So apart from that, this is the immediate thing, but there's the long-term damage that every other person we speak to in the community suffers from respiratory illness or other chronic illnesses like cancer. And also there are shorter lifespans in the entire community. So it's literally life-taking, you know, this kind of issue. And even though it's not treated with the same urgency as like an issue of gun violence, it should be, because it really has the same kind of damages. So the campaign that started in 27, Aare Nuestra Aire, it's not, it builds on, 30, 40 years of work that El Puente has been doing. But this particular campaign started 2 years back, and it started with air monitoring, youth-led air monitoring, which I'll talk a little bit about. But the idea was to not just keep it to a scientific study, but to connect it to cultural organizing, connect it to advocacy and political education, mitigation planning and design, and awareness raising campaigns. So when we started, a group of 60 young people from El Puente's leadership centers really went through the exercise of learning how to monitor air in their own community and counting trucks, etc. And we were partnering with some university and the Department of Health in doing that. And they helped us, and also the New York City's Environmental Justice Alliance. And we use these low-cost portable sensors that you can connect to your phones. And the young people kind of went out to schools and parks in the community to monitor how much PM 2.5 is there in the air, because that's really the finest particulate matter and what harms, in terms of health, what harms us the most and settles in our lungs. And these were co-located with more expensive, high-quality sensors from the city's system. And later on, we found that actually what the young people collected matched very much with what the stationary high-quality monitors give. So we know that this kind of youth-led study is actually very successful. We also had young people analyze the data and propose solutions about what they think should be done to counter it. And we are working with other experts to really visualize that data. So this builds up on the study that we did in 2016 called Urban Lab for Open Spaces, that found that in some of our key playgrounds, our few playgrounds, the air pollution is 4 to 6 times, at its peak, it's 4 to 6 times higher than that what's recommended by national levels. We also found out which are the most polluted hotspots in the neighborhood and what times of the day they're most polluted at. And one of the biggest findings was really that from the 90s to now, there hasn't been a huge change. Even though in the rest of the city, air quality levels have improved, it hasn't in this particular neighborhood. And you can only find that when you study hyperlocal data, because the census tract data really shows this as a gentrified community. You know, it doesn't locate the smaller corridors that are facing these environmental hazards. So, you know, data has built in a lot of inequities and biases. And I'm sure that's something that is going to be talked about in our conversation and is interesting. And one thing we did to counter this kind of bias that data has inherently, because we also couldn't afford to buy very expensive equipment that actually also captures like black carbon and other particulate matter, or study, you know, what the indoor pollution is like. So we weren't getting the full picture as it matches with the experiences of residents on the ground. So to counter it, we started doing qualitative studies and doing like conducting oral history interviews, which we are just releasing on Earth Day. And we really captured the stories of how, you know, several generations of residents, school teachers, parents, how their experience has been growing up, dealing with their respiratory illnesses, living in such conditions where there's so much pollution everywhere they go, and where do they take their children to play, you know, really getting the humanity of the stories. We also used a lot of arts and cultural organizing. We work with an incredible group of artists called Cadre, and who's a group of local artists who work with developing theater, like intergenerational theater, that help communicate what this data is saying. So, you know, really reinterpreting scientific data through popular education tools so that it could be available to a very wide audience. And we also interpreted the platform that we were proposing through theater. And that was after COVID hit, so it was virtual theater. And we had puppet shows, we had young people kind of engage with this data and the campaign in many different ways. That's a flash mob that they did in one of the open spaces to get people to talk about what the issue is. We also like believe in going where people are instead of expecting them to come to us. So, you know, going to classrooms, going to open spaces, doing park service days, conducting community forums, also being plugging into the larger climate work happening, including the march, because again, a lot of the work we do is youth-led. Being able to plug into social media. Our petition has like thousands of signatures. So we know, and in spite of that, we are having trouble, you know, mobilizing our electeds. So one of the things that this campaign last year, phase one of it ended in was this 5-point community-led action platform, which kind of had very detailed, you can go to the website and check it out. It has very detailed recommendations for 5 different ways in which you can actually address this problem immediately. There are short-term, long-term, medium-term recommendations, but it really gives an actionable pathway to how you can deal with this issue in a way that's rooted in self-determination, so that, you know, instead of just depending on external grants and the agendas of our electors, we can say that, okay, we already know how to solve this problem, just give us the funds and give us the technical expertise to actually do it. And in those, we know we have green walls. We work with Pratt and the New School to develop many of these. We have like electrifying the bus fleet, closing down certain streets to reduce vehicular traffic, even big proposals like the BQ Green, which is like a decking along the BQE. And that's a proposal that came around like years ago, which hasn't gained as much traction as it should. And you know, there's a whole series of recommendations. So now we're working on really implementing these recommendations, and we are doing it through working groups. We are doing through you know, raising funds around each part of the platform that seems feasible right now. And it's really like unfolding in the way that we did imagine it. And we work a lot through coalitions. So it's not just us, we are part of like a lot of different coalitions, and we even started a resiliency coalition through this project. So just to summarize in terms of environmental justice, what we are really saying in terms of open spaces is that open spaces are not just recreation spaces. In environmental justice communities, they are mitigation and public health tools, and they should be viewed as such, and they should be budgeted for as such. And public health and parks and environmental justice communities like ours can only be transformed through dedicated policies and action, not just a parks budget, not just a general budget. There has to be very specific action that's taken when you're talking about parks in communities like ours. And for that, we need to look through a lens of real, authentic equity, not just the buzzword that everyone likes to use now, but really looking at what that means. It means like putting more funds, not just as much funds everywhere else, but putting more funds in communities that are affected by environmental justice issues historically, which is often low-income communities of color, and making sure that who determines where those funds are used is really community members and community leaders and community organizations. So, making sure that even funding is community driven. So in terms of taking action, what the next, and what we are doing now is, apart from doing these working groups and task forces, we're also conducting a lot of community forums and green table talks to reach out to people where they are. And we're organizing a lot of city council candidate forums, being a part of mayoral forums. We're organizing a youth-led environmental justice town hall so that young people can bring politicians to task and introduce this platform to their campaigns. We're also trying to block out open streets through the open street, the new thing that's happening around the Open Street Initiative. And we are doing like park action days. And we're also trying to think about bigger plans like community land trusts and green zone legislation that we are lobbying towards. We are using a lot of public art, including, leveraging our oral history interviews, continuing to use community theater, working with our young people to, do more research around how this issue affects children specifically. How do you communicate? How do you add this information to a school curriculum and really condense it in a way that's accessible to everyone? Because we know that data is not always accessible. And we are trying to work with, all our partners and stakeholders to create a resiliency plan so that in the face of COVID, and we know that climate change is going to only make this kind of situation happen more frequently and worse. So we have to be better prepared for it as a community. So these are just some of the things we're doing. And I just want to thank you for having us with this really great group of panelists. Passing it back to you, Alexander.
Thanks for such a comprehensive look at what you're doing. Actually, we had some great audience questions, and some of which you actually started addressing as we were going through, but I would like to ask a few questions first before I get to some of the audience questions. Do you see the pandemic, you said already, is exacerbating these circumstances? Do you see ways that transitioning back can be used to a more normal way, can be used to push forward change and address inequity?
Yeah, I don't know if you were asking the question specifically to me, but yeah, definitely. I mean, the minute COVID-19 only hit in between our campaign, the issue was already there. But the fact that how much worse COVID-19 made it really helped us leverage the issue back into political consciousness, into the, on the radar of people, because a lot of people just learn to live with asthma. A lot of people just learn to live with the fact that these are the conditions of the community. And to make it relevant again, it was very important to see that COVID-19 was actually killing people based on the fact that, where you lived and where you were located and whether or not you already had these kind of issues. So it also is helping us bring it to the attention of, the power brokers, the people who have access to funds, I can't tell you yet if it's increasing our opportunity, our access to these funds, climate funds, and to to other resources that can expedite the process, because we are still really in there. I can tell you maybe in 5 years whether it really had the impact of of if people really took action, because COVID-19 really highlighted these kind of issues so much more than ever. But definitely we have had more attention, and it's brought it to relevance, and we've integrated into a platform in a way that it really that people really understand that you have to take, this is something to take urgent action around. It's actually going to cause more deaths than ever before if it remains unaddressed. So mhm.
Yeah, and just to like add on more simply, put the Masoom put there, like the federal government just put trillions of dollars into Americans, into communities in COVID relief, right? And I don't think, I mean, I'm sure there's some people out there that see exactly where every dollar is going to go. And I don't think we'll know if it's going into the right places. Like, we have the opportunity. Yes, Alexander, the opportunity just happened. We put so much money into society. We can use this still, I think, to transition off of fossil fuels, put it into communities that deserve it to grow and expand, to fully recover and be more resilient in the future. Are we going to do that? I think it's up to our current administration right now and the people who are responsible for allocating all the funds that just hit our economy.
Great. So is there a strategy that you're finding that's really effective in getting these grass movements going to address the inequality issues in local communities? What are your strategies? That's based on some of the questions we've been getting from the audience. Just engage and get young people and communities involved in fighting and even coming up or proposing solutions that are relevant to their communities.
I guess this is kind of posed to all of us. So Masoom and Eric, feel free to piggyback off anything. But Eric kind of already touched on this a little bit in his introduction. Is there's kind of an insider-outsider strategy for making sure we can really tackle a lot of the grassroots issues around climate change. And I know we talked about the North Brooklyn pipeline, right? At Food and Water Watch, we fight a lot on a bunch of different like power plant and pipeline fights. And on the inside, there's lobbying, there's a lot of internal advocacy to move politicians to do the right thing. But really, what is the difference between saving the planet or going extinct? It is getting that engagement, like you said, of youth leaders, of grassroots leaders, through canvassing, through field organizing, through doing multiple protests, actions, rallies, to kind of shaking up the status quo with what we're used to. And that's a strategy that was affirmed from the fracking ban back in 2014. And it's continued to work. So I can talk about, that there's a frack gas plant in the city of NYPIRG. This is kind of like a prime example of environmental injustice. The city of NYPIRG is a predominantly, Black Latinx community that's already dealing with, issues with their water, with PFAS contamination. A Wall Street private equity firm wants to build out a frack gas plant on that water, on the Hudson River, and continue to pollute the air there. And really, we've been able to get 28 municipal resolutions representing 1.5 million New Yorkers, and in particular, really been able to center the voices in the city of NYPIRG by knocking on doors. So a lot of this is really grunt work, and you have to really get out of your comfort zone. You have to be able to protest. You have to be able to approach politicians. It's much tougher now during COVID too. So we have to get creative. We have to find ways to do this virtually and do banner drops and all sorts of things. But when you make noise and raise your voice, other people will have the courage to do the same. And what starts out as two canvassers, 4 canvassers turns into teams of 20 or 30, which turns into rallies of hundreds of people. And taking it to the streets is, when you then go back to Albany and are like, hey, we need to pass this bill that bans all power plants. Your legislator that was kind of iffy before was like, I don't want hundreds of people yelling at me. I'm going to sign this. I'm with Team Earth. So taking that outsider approach, whether it's the friendliest or not, is the most effective.
Yeah, and I can't wait to get back to those tactics as, we're seeing the curve go down here with the pandemic, and, it's gonna be a lot to get out there and knock on doors about, rally about. And I just want to speak to people, students here especially have seen this happen over the past years. You kind of lose the enthusiasm of fighting these campaigns because we can't knock on doors, because we can't rally, right? But like the virtual work that Santosh, Masoom, that NYPIRG, that all of us have been doing is equally as impactful. The New York State Legislature still has their doors locked in Albany. You can't go in to the Legislative Office building. You can't go into the Capitol building. This is where, we did our lobby meetings with, dozens of community members. This is where we did press conferences and rallies and all this, and it's still locked, on COVID restrictions. So the way that they're operating, is, well, behind closed doors in that sense, but virtually, right? So if that's the only avenue that they're giving us, to weigh in, we need to take advantage of that. Santosh talked about the Dan Scammer plant in Newburgh. They held a public hearing a couple weeks ago, and they weren't prepared for 800 people to show up, and they couldn't accommodate this public hearing because of all the work we did, and that right there, that's pressure, and that took a lot of organizing right there. These virtual rallies, and you get hundreds of people talking about issues, even if it's in a virtual room, and you got one reporter there, you got one person from your representative's office there. They're like, yo, this thing happened, like it was virtually. This is the type of stuff that keeps going. So, just that onto Santosh, like, yes, let's continue to knock on doors out of this thing, continue to rally, but while we get through the end of it, like, don't drop the virtual activism too, because we've been able to accomplish so much over the past year with it. And just sign up for Puente and Food and Water Watch and NYPIRG, and get through the end of this together and keep fighting in person in the future.
Yeah. And also, like, young people are super experts in virtual organizing. I think we have to look at them for leadership there. And I think that's one of the things, I think when you recruit young people, and I think El Puente has done that in its history, is that it's not as effective as when you have young people leading some of this work, having them, making decisions and shaping these campaigns and being a part of that. And because climate change and environment is something that affects them more than anyone else, people are really concerned, and a lot of young people really want to know how these issues show up in their backyards. Like someone asked, how do I talk in the question, how do I talk to this about this issue to my friends? And that's, young people ask that all the time, so really breaking down what this means, what this kind of environmental justice means and how it shows up in your own community, either in the form of air pollution, in the form of water pollution, in the form of, this pipeline that's going through literally people's backyard that has an explosion radius that can actually, impact hospitals, all kinds of schools, things that young people really do connect to, places that they walk through practically. So also, I think it's not a short-term thing, engaging young people. I mean, it's such a, like, you have to have programs and things that engage people in the long term. Like El Puente had started one of the first social justice public schools. They had shut down one of the violent schools and started one of the first social justice public schools that became really one of the leading schools, and it was all about how you integrate social justice into education. And these are the young people who are really also part of the campaigns. We also have like all our leadership centers and our programs that are already working with young people in a parallel with working with our social justice campaign. So it's not like a separate thing, working with young people. It's almost like integral to everything you do. And which is why I guess holistic organizing is so important, because it has so many different aspects to connect. But yeah, young people are key, and often using the arts is a big way to involve. I mean, young people are so much more enthusiastic when we are using arts in organizing, whether that's visual or performance or theater or any kind of those artistic and cultural tools that help them feel more engaged.
So I'm wondering if you can think about some of the more successful campaigns you've been on, and what were some of the key lessons you learned that people could use to support these types of changes?
I beat you to it, Eric. I think a lot of what we have to say, though, especially with NYPIRG, is really similar. We both of our groups fought to stop the Williams pipeline, which has been denied permits 3 times, and now they're applying again, weirdly, and they will get stopped a 4th time. But what we found really successful there. It is really that community, that very local community engagement. So making sure that, this is a pipeline that would have been proposed under the Rockaways in Queens. The Rockaway Civics Association, we did a ton of organizing near the NYSHA housing there, a ton of local organizing. But when you have that kind of local engagement and real local leadership on an issue, that has a ripple effect that you really can't produce without it, regardless of how much influence and power you have. And when those local leaders step up, those are also the people that vote in those politicians that live there. So as when I'm thinking of like Dance Camera, as much as I can put in resources as Food and Water Watch or as NYPIRG or whatever, we need the local leaders like Mark Sanchez Potter or to step up and be the voices that really carry the message against the fossil fuel industry. So one, putting the power in those folks' hands is incredibly important. But then two, making this really simple and enjoyable, right? A lot of these aren't crazy tactics. What Eric said is we had a virtual hearing where we packed the hearing with 800 people. They're used to accommodating hearings with like 50 tops. That takes a lot of phone banking. That takes a lot of text banking. Doing this kind of like really simple but grunt work is the difference between getting 100 people to something or getting 1,000. You got to just put in the man work for that, and that takes also inspiring and motivating other people. And the people that are honestly the best at it are the youth. So folks, especially college students, those are the ones that are coming up and filling those phone banks and doing the organizing. So what we see at the rallies is a huge wide diversity of people, but then there's this core group of organizers that have really even shown us up and showing that there's hope to take on this giant industry. So I would say centering those local voices and making sure that they have the tools to use grassroots organizing techniques like phone banking. Door knocking has come to a standstill, but the street canvassing, those strategies are kind of how we were able to build the base to stop the Williams pipeline, and we're able to pack those hearings and move those politicians. And it's a formula that we're going to keep using.
Yeah, and just to sprinkle on there, one thing that I've learned that you asked Alexander is It's never over. Santosh mentioned the Williams pipeline. We're about to fight it for the third or fourth time. Dan Scammer, we beat Dan Scammer as a coal plant. They left it as a toxic ash dump and then came back on the same site and turned it into a frack gas plant. We're fighting them again. So the one thing I want to say is keep in touch with your networks. Keep it going. You want an issue, but keep that celebratory thing going, and know that it's not going to permanently go away unless you disband. So keep your networks in your heart and close to you.
I want to thank all the panelists for your great insights and all the fantastic work that you're doing. Unfortunately, we have to start transferring over to the next set of panelists. And I want to thank all the organizers of EcoFest as well, but especially all the panelists.
Thank you so much, Alexander, Eric, Santosh, Masoom, for a fabulous panel, and thank you for all your hard work on behalf of environmental justice. Coming up next, our next panel, Innovative Technologies. Dr. Richard Hanley, Executive Director of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center, will be hosting,